Hello to you, I do hope you're well, and a very warm welcome to this A-level English Language Revision session. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we're taking a look at regional variation. And of course this is all about how where you are from affects how you speak and how you use language in terms of your accent, your dialect, and the words which you use to communicate. So I thought to start us off, we'd take a look at words for bread roll around the UK. So this is a great bit of data that I came across, and it is a survey by linguistics researchers at Manchester University. And in 2014, they found that these were the most commonly used terms for bread roll. So bread roll was used by about 36 people nationally. Okay, so it was a national term, a national lexis used to describe your classic bread roll. Now, the next popular one was bap, spoken by 18% of people nationally, especially those in Scotland and Ireland. People in Northern England used bun and barm. People in West Yorkshire used muffin. People in the Midlands used the word cob. Do you want to have cob? Go on then. And people in Yorkshire used tea cake. Also in the northeast, stottle cake, and in Lancashire, oven bottom was the term used for a bread roll, don't you know? So that is just a great way to bring to life, if you like, to get us thinking about the fact that across the country, people do have different ways of speaking, be it their accent, so if they've got a Cockney accent, or they've got rusticity in their speech from the West Country. It's all about the accents and then about the words we use because of where we come from. So we're going to be taking a look at how much where you do come from affects the way in which you speak, and then asking whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So there's two bits that we really want to cover today. It is talking all about the fact that people's accents are good or bad, and it's talking about the fact that, well, do we actually have to have these accents? So we're looking at whether regional variation is a thing, and then taking it further, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? So lots of people to talk about, from Peter Trudgill to Alex Baratta, lots and lots of people with big ideas on the issue of regional variation in speech. So imagine we're sat there in the exam, picture the scene, and the question is, let me just find the question, one moment, here we are. It would help. Evaluate the view that where a person comes from determines the language they use. Okay, so you could start with saying, well, yes, it does, because regional accents are prevalent and arise because of physical differences in where people live. And I'll be bringing in straight away here Peter Trudgill, who of course researched Isogloss Boundaries. So the idea that around the country in the past, you couldn't really move. So if you were from the north of England, it would be very rare for you to end up in the south because of the physical barriers. You know, you'd have to get in your horse and car. 5 years later, you might make it to Birmingham. You know, there were physical barriers keeping little communities as an individual community. So you couldn't move around. And so everybody lived in little self-contained bubbles, if you like. And within those bubbles, specific ways of speaking, so an accent, as well as a specific lexis and use of language. Because remember, different communities do different things. So you might have been a farming community, it might have been factory workers, all different communities. And so it's right that your language would reflect that. Because say if you're talking about farming, you're going to be speaking in a very, very different way to if, say, you're talking about mining. They're quite different things, and so there's a different set of lexis and a different way of speaking for both of them, and what you would then be using in your everyday speech as a community. Remember, social groups, communities of practice, the idea that you're sharing a practice, Levin Wenger, that we have that domain. And so we use language to meet the group's needs. So it would be right that different self-contained communities spoke in different ways. And those isogloss boundaries played a role in that, separating people so that you were in that community, you couldn't really move around, and so you developed that sense of identity in your local area, and with that came the local way of speaking. But, and of course we're always about the evaluation at A level, it could then be said, however, these isogloss boundaries have now weakened. So Trudgill found in his research that they've now weakened because of transport, because of the media. So actually we could say, whilst where you came from traditionally determined the way in which you spoke, today, because of the weakening of those isogloss boundaries, because people are travelling more, because they're going to different places, because of the media, you know, when you turn on the TV, you're now being exposed to so many different accents. It's not just the received pronunciation, it's not just the Queen's English. We're seeing all these different accents, and so that exposure to the way different people are speaking could arguably mean that our individual accents, based on where we originally come from, are weakening because we're travelling more, we're interacting with completely different communities and different people in different social settings. So we could say that now people are actually less influenced because of those boundaries weakening. And so your next point could be, no, where you're from doesn't determine your accent, because people today decide how they will speak and whether they should modify their accent. And that is something you can do. So Daniel Jones, and he started off in about 1916 saying that received pronunciation, or public school pronunciation as he called it then, was the most prestigious way of speaking. He found that the people in the South whose sons went off to boarding school were using this public school pronunciation, this perfect elocution and way of speaking. And so he associated that with a way of speaking that was about power and prestige. The successful people, the high achieving people, the wealthy people were using this received pronunciation. And so he originally published a handbook for using this way of speaking, because it was basically saying, right, if you want to be successful, if you want to be seen as achieving in this country, you need to be speaking in this certain way. And of course that links in very nicely to Dr. Alex Baratta, who we'll be talking about in just a little bit, and his ideas on accenteism and the fact that certain accents do seem to have very derogatory connotations to them, and people make assumptions based on the way you're speaking. So Daniel Jones originally thought everybody who wants to be a success needs to speak with this received pronunciation, with this public school pronunciation, the way of speaking the language of the powerful, the rich and the wealthy in our society. However, he later revised his position, and he said actually it's up to the individual to decide whether to modify the way in which they're speaking. He said it's up to the individual to decide whether to speak in the way that comes naturally to them, or whether they should alter the way they speak. So he was then essentially saying it's actually a personal choice. And it could be nice to bring in here code switching, which is of course Nicholas Copeland, and his idea that when we're moving from public to private discourse, the context is key, that it's all about who we're talking to. So you could say, well, you will speak in your accent when you're back at home, but then when you're at work, for example, you might speak in a more standard English. You might speak with a more received pronunciation. And this could link in quite nicely to Leslie Milroy, and the idea that when we have a closed network, when we have a higher network density score, so when everybody in the group has that solidarity and there is a real sense of identity and common purpose amongst them, there is more conformity to the non-standard forms. So that when we're back in the pub with your mates, after a long day of work, you slip back into your accent, or you return to your traditional dialect. But then, say if you were a teacher, in front of your class, or if you're speaking to your line manager or to the head teacher, you might speak in a more standardised or received pronunciation because of the different social contexts. So we could argue The language that you use is determined by where you're from to an extent, but then the social context is equally as important to people. And then we could say, if we wanted another point for why where you come from does shape the language you use, we could say there's lexical evidence showing how it's shaped. So you could use those bread roll examples. There's also, I've got them all prepared, don't you worry, plenty of examples. So croaker is a word used, I'm told, for doctor in the Midlands. Grizzle, to have a grizzle, is to complain or moan in Wales. Slummy is the word for loose change in Liverpool. Pomsani is a jam sandwich in the southeast. Make sure you know what you're ordering next time. And sayings like he's got a right cob on is about if you're in a mood in the northwest, or were you born in a barn is shut the door in Yorkshire. So lots and lots of examples there of the lexical variations and that develop out of those communities. Those different regions have their different unique ways of speaking and dialects that emerge as a result. And of course we've then actually got accents themselves. So for example, the Cockney accent, which is characterised by glottal stopping, so that's where the letter T is pronounced with the back of the throat in between the vowels. I do apologise if I offend anyone in these attempts, and I will call them attempts to bring the accents to life. So better is pronounced, this is going to be awful, please do prepare yourself. Better, something like that, B-E, comma, U-H. The L vocalisation, the L at the end of words often becomes a vowel sound. So pal can sound like pow, or trouble, trouble. I'm thinking of Danny Dyer on EastEnders right now. Is anybody else? Gorgeous. And Cockney accent, F fronting. The th in words like think is pronounced with a more forward consonant. So for example, thing is thing, or this as dis. And actually that's a feature of Caribbean English as well. So it's clear that, you know, where you're from shapes your pronunciation, it shapes your accent. So for example, in the West Country, there's a lot of rusticity. So that's where you pronounce your R sounds more. So for example, mother would be mother. That's a bit pirate. Never mind. So mother, the R sound is more pronounced. Or G dropping might be a characteristic of your accent. So winning, running, the emission of the G sound at the end. And what's important here is that those accents are unique to where you're from. You know, Cockney, and you might use the Cockney rhyming slang, apples and pears. It's known for being in London. Or, you know, the Liverpudlian accent, obviously, from Liverpool. So we've got clear evidence that different regions of the UK have different accents. And we can say that's because, you know, it's about solidarity and identity, and you learn it and model it from your parents. It could be about actually what's in the genes. We don't know, you know, your pronunciation of certain words, how you're taught from a very early age, the shaping of your mouth movements to influence and shape your accent. And then obviously what is going on around you. So if it was a mining community, what's the language going to represent? If it is a farming community, how is your language going to reflect that? And then obviously we bring in the fact that today there is so much flexibility, movement, change and media in the UK, especially now when we've got a position, sort of things Daniel Jones of, well, actually, is it better to speak in a more standardised way? That we've got this now, the idea of received pronunciation, the Queen's English, is that a language of power? Or should we actually be embracing and celebrating all the different accents people speak? And this brings us perfectly on to the second part of regional variation. And the question could be, or it could even be an article, this would be a nice article to write, about accenteeism. So if it was an essay, it might say, evaluate the idea that accenteeism is a problem in society today. So is this a problem? Now, a man that would be saying it absolutely is Dr. Alex Baratta, and he's from the University of Manchester. and he found that there is a stigma around certain accents. So he studied 100 participants, and he found that a third of people feel they have to modify their accent because of stereotypes and stigma over whether they would be employed. So he found that people would say, right, well, if I'm off to a job interview, I need to modify my accent. I might need to tone it down. I need to watch whether I'm pronouncing all my letters, whether I'm speaking in a standard English, whether I'm using a received pronunciation. People were saying that they needed to modify their accents because of the negative attitudes around them. Now, what could we say in response to this? We could say, well, his study was only of 100 people based around the University of Manchester. It's a very small snapshot. So can we actually generalise these findings to the whole of the population? And we could say that actually today there is a lot more representation in business, and we'll be talking about the BBC in just a minute. BBC, you know, you've now got Steph McGovern presenting the business, you've got Hugh Edwards, the main anchor of the news at 10. Both have got very strong regional accents, but they're both in influential positions. They're on national television. And so the fact could be that actually today accents are being embraced, accents are being celebrated, and it is not necessarily that if you want to be a success and get on in life, you need to speak with received pronunciation. You need to speak with the Queen's English. Dr. Bernard Lamb, another key linguist, found, and he said, the Queen's English can be spoken in many different accents. That as long as you're using more of a standard English, that people can understand what you're saying, that your grammar is correct, then actually what accent you have shouldn't matter. So we could then say, well, accentism is not a problem in society today, because we could say people are proud of their accents, and actually, as opposed to accents causing trouble, they actually bring people together, and they're actually a source of celebration. So we could say accents create solidarity and community cohesion. So things like daft as a brush in Yorkshire, Pomsani in the southeast, or slummy for money in Liverpool. These are words that people use as part of their everyday lives and that are very unique to that area. And so they might feel a real sense of identity from using that language because it's part of their way of life. It's part of their community. It's how they work, if you like. And then we could bring in Milroy, as we said before, the social network practice. The idea that the non-standard forms are more prevalent for stronger groups. So if you've got a higher social network score, and she rated them on a scale of 1 to 5, then you are more likely to use the non-standard forms in language. And she tested this by looking at how people said the word hat, so the A sound in hat, and how they said mother, the TH sound in mother, and was testing whether they were conforming to the standard or they were using a non-standard form. And what she found was that there was more non-standard forms when people felt stronger in a group. So this could suggest that it is very, very clear that accents create identity, they create solidarity. If we throw it back to the Isogloss Boundaries, they were key to developing that sense of community and collective identity. So we could then say, in response to that point, that this is within only certain communities. So it's okay at home. So when you are with your family, that's fine. But in different contexts, for example, occupations, it's not quite the case. You do need to change how you speak. There is the issue of accentism. So you could say, well, whilst it's beneficial at home, in the community, when you're in the boardroom and in business, accentism is indeed a problem. So we could then say, yes, accentism is a problem because people are told to use received pronunciation to sound better. And you could draw upon Daniel Jones's original work, which was saying that the public school English, public school pronunciation, was the language of power and prestige. That if you wanted to be powerful, you wanted to be seen as a success, you had to have this way of speaking. It was taught to the menfolk of the wealthy in the South. it was the language associated with power and prestige. You know, the royal family, the Queen's English, speaking in this certain way. And so other accents would be seen as lesser. They would be treated as not equal to this prestigious form of language, which was all about power and prestige. So we could say, well, people are being told, teachers today are even being told in the classroom, that they need to change their accents in order to be understood and to be seen as credible and to have any authority in the classroom, because children can't understand what they're saying because of their accents. But we could then bring in our evaluation, as always, and say, however, Daniel Jones later changed his position and said it is actually up to the individual. So we could say there's actually now been progress, that accents are now being embraced and celebrated, although of course we could bring in there that they're actually dying out because of movement and because of media and because of this move to everything becoming more mainstream, that all these accents and these communities are actually dying out, and we're all converging in our language use to one mainstream way of speaking and expressing ourselves. But we could link that in to talking about the media and say, no, accentism is not a problem today because there is now greater diversity in accents in the media. So Hugh Edwards and Steph McGovern could be little case studies, if you like, here. We could say that as long, this is the new BBC guidelines, as long as you speak in standard English, then your accent does not matter. Bernard Lamb, the Queen's English can be spoken in many different accents. So as long as you're speaking in standard English, so as long as you're constructing your sentences correctly and you're articulating yourself in a way that people understand, then your actual accent is not a barrier. So the fact that we now have people with very strong regional dialects in the mainstream media is perhaps a sign that accentism is no longer a problem, because there is greater exposure to accents, there is this tolerance, there is this diversity, and that is a good thing. It's a sign of the diversity and celebration in society. However, we could say there is still so much criticism. People write into the BBC all the time about accents and saying, oh, I can't understand this person, they shouldn't be on air. When Hugh Edwards was appointed, there was an uproar that someone with such a strong Welsh accent could be reading the main national news every night. So there's still a lot of negative perceptions and attitudes around accents, but we could say that there is progress being made. There is greater inclusion, greater tolerance, and greater diversity. So lots of ideas there about accents and regional variation. My top tip is to make sure you have got your evidence and your examples. So for example, your L vocalisation for Cockney, your glottal stopping for Cockney accents. You've got your words like back, bar, muffin. You've got slummy for money in Liverpool, G-dropping, winning and running, the West Country rusticity with the R sound. You've got little bits that you can just drop into your answer to show that you know what you're talking about, but then also maybe some examples of the more standard English that people use perhaps in business. And if you've got any case studies about teachers that have been told to change their accents, or people in business who have become successful in spite of strong regional accents, they are great as well. But that's just a quick look at regional accents. Thank you very much for joining me. I've been Ben Wardle, and you can follow me on Instagram, benwardle_, or on Twitter at benwardle UK. Thank you very much for your company. The very best of luck in your exams. Have a good day. Bye bye for now.